Nobody in Washington saw this moment coming. The camera cuts to a packed congressional hearing room, its atmosphere thick with partisanship. Republican Senator Jerry Moran of Kansas leans forward, his face steady but unreadable, as Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett concludes her passionate defense of her rural health care bill. Across the long table, Democrats and Republicans sit rigidly divided, their body language speaking volumes. For 3 minutes, Crockett has outlined a plan designed to address one of America's most pressing crises, the collapse of healthcare access in underserved communities. The chairman is already glancing at his watch, ready to move on. Then, without warning, Moran requests the microphone. The room stills. Everyone knows the script. A senior Republican dismantles a progressive Democrat's proposal with partisan talking points. But what happens next doesn't just break the script, it rewrites it. Moran clears his throat, adjusts his glasses, and speaks. "In my 27 years in Congress," he begins, his Kansas drawl deliberate, "I have rarely seen legislation that so directly tackles the healthcare emergency in rural America. Congresswoman Crockett, your proposal isn't just sound policy. It is exactly what my constituents have been begging for." A ripple of disbelief sweeps the room. Democrats exchange stunned glances. Republicans shift in their seats, visibly unsettled. Crockett herself is momentarily speechless, the weight of the moment written across her face. A conservative Republican senator is not just refraining from attack, he is validating her work, on the record, in front of the nation. In the next 5 minutes, what unfolds doesn't merely surprise a congressional committee. It ignites a conversation that will ripple across the country, redefining how Americans think about political courage, integrity, and the rare but powerful possibility of true bipartisan cooperation. And this moment cannot be understood without knowing who these two figures really are. Senator Jerry Moran represents the traditional backbone of Republican politics. At 69, he has spent decades cultivating a reputation for steadiness and diligence rather than spectacle. Raised in Kansas, the son of a nurse who served small-town clinics, Moran grew up watching neighbors struggle as rural hospitals shuttered. It left a permanent mark. While he built his career on fiscal conservatism, agricultural policy, and veterans affairs, his quiet passion has always been rural healthcare. Unlike colleagues who thrive on media theatrics, Moran works methodically in committee rooms, far from cameras. Consons reward him with comfortable re-election margins, valuing his consistency and his willingness, on rare but critical occasions, to put local needs above party orthodoxy. In recent years, however, frustration had been mounting. As partisan battles hardened, progress on rural healthcare stalled. With one hospital after another closing in small towns, Moran began searching for solutions wherever they came from, even if that meant crossing the aisle. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett could hardly appear more different. At 43, she entered Congress in 2022, representing Texas's 30th district, an area rooted in Dallas's predominantly Black and Hispanic communities. Before politics, Crockett built her career as a civil rights attorney and public defender, fighting systemic inequities in courtrooms where the odds were often stacked against her clients. In Washington, she quickly established herself as a bold, progressive voice, championing voting rights, criminal justice reform, and equitable health care. Her speeches bristle with urgency, her questions cut with surgical precision. But behind her progressive platform, Crockett carried a deep and unexpected concern: rural America. While investigating healthcare deserts in urban Dallas, she discovered parallels in rural Texas, communities starved of doctors, clinics on the brink of financial collapse, families driving hours for basic care. It was a mirror image of what Moran's Kansas towns were facing. Their politics might be worlds apart, but their diagnosis of the problem was uncannily similar. That discovery led Crockett to craft the Rural Health Care Access and Improvement Act, a bill designed to stabilize rural hospitals, incentivize medical professionals to serve underserved areas, and channel targeted funding into communities left behind by the healthcare system. And when Moran leaned into his microphone that day, breaking from partisan tradition to endorse her bill, it wasn't just a gesture. It was the collision of two life stories, one rooted in the clinics of Kansas, the other in the courtrooms of Texas, proving that sometimes, even in Washington, truth can outweigh party. Section 7 includes a graduated forgiveness structure that incentivizes professionals to stay longer, Crockett explained, gesturing to the binder of provisions in front of her. The more years of service, the greater the forgiveness. By year 10, doctors and nurses can eliminate nearly all of their student debt. The design isn't just about recruitment, it's about retention and building roots in the community. Moran leaned back slightly, steepling his fingers as he studied her. The committee room seemed to sense that something unusual was happening. This wasn't the standard partisan joust, the kind where each side performed for cameras. Instead, it was something quieter, more dangerous to the entrenched order, genuine dialogue. You've also included telehealth expansion provisions, Moran continued, his Kansas drawl deliberate but steady. We've seen telemedicine work well in western Kansas, but broadband limitations remain a significant barrier. How does your bill ensure equity for communities where internet access itself is unreliable? Crockett didn't miss a beat. We anticipated that. Section 5 ties telehealth expansion to rural broadband grants through the Department of Agriculture. Health access and internet access have to move in tandem. Otherwise, one without the other just deepens disparities. A murmur rippled through the room. Staffers glanced at each other. Reporters lifted their heads from their phones, and members of Congress leaned forward, realizing this wasn't going according to script. This wasn't supposed to happen. A senior Republican senator was not supposed to be trading policy solutions with a progressive freshman Democrat as though they shared common ground. And yet, here they were, sketching out the beginnings of something that defied political gravity. When Moran spoke again, his tone shifted. It wasn't the calculated voice of a senator guarding his party line. It was personal. "Congresswoman," he said, pausing, "my mother was a nurse in a clinic, much like the ones your bill is designed to save. I grew up watching patients drive 90 miles for basic care because the nearest hospital couldn't keep its doors open. That experience shaped why I've spent my career focused on rural healthcare. And what you've presented here today, it reflects the concerns my constituents voice to me every single day." The silence that followed was palpable. Democrats blinked in astonishment. Republicans shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to look at their colleague or their shoes. Crockett herself looked briefly stunned, her hand hovering over her notes, as though frozen in mid-thought. And then, Moran leaned closer to the microphone. His words came slow, deliberate, impossible to mistake. "In my 27 years serving in Congress, I have rarely encountered legislation that so thoroughly addresses the healthcare crisis facing rural America. Congresswoman Crockett, your proposal isn't just good policy, it's necessary policy, and I intend to support it." The effect was immediate. Gasps echoed across the room. One aide dropped a pen, another typed furiously, their phone lighting up with alerts bound for Twitter and news desks nationwide. The chairman blinked, momentarily forgetting his prepared script, before recovering with a half-hearted, "Thank you, Senator Moran." But the damage, or perhaps the healing, was already done. What unfolded in those 5 minutes shattered expectations. For decades, Americans had grown accustomed to Congress as a theater of division, where loyalty to party mattered more than loyalty to people. And yet here, in an ordinary hearing room, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday. Something extraordinary had occurred. A Republican senator had crossed the invisible line, not out of political calculation, but out of conviction. It was a moment that hinted at something larger, that courage in politics wasn't dead, that bipartisan cooperation wasn't impossible, that somewhere beneath the layers of distrust and partisanship, lawmakers still recognized the urgency of human need. And as the cameras captured Crockett's stunned expression, Moran's steady gaze, and the committee's collective disbelief, viewers at home were left with a question that transcended policy itself. What if more leaders chose principle over party? What if this wasn't the exception, but the beginning of a new rule? Because sometimes it only takes one unexpected act of integrity to redraw the map of what Americans believe is possible. One could miss the symbolism. A conservative Republican senator and a progressive Democratic congresswoman, standing side by side, shaking hands over a shared commitment to fixing America's fractured healthcare system. The image was simple, but powerful. Two figures divided by ideology, yet united by responsibility. Journalists rushed to capture the moment, their earlier cynicism replaced by genuine intrigue. Within hours, clips of the exchange between Crockett and Moran began circulating on news broadcasts and social media feeds. Commentators described it as a rare glimpse of bipartisanship in an era defined by gridlock. Some framed it as a turning point, others as a fleeting anomaly. But for many Americans watching, it was a reminder of what governance could look like when problem-solving outweighs posturing. Behind the scenes, the ripple effects were immediate. Democratic leadership, initially skeptical of Crockett's proposal, convened late-night meetings to reassess its viability. Republican aides fielded calls from rural hospital administrators, urging their representatives to follow Moran's lead. Policy analysts scrambled to run fresh numbers on the bill's projected impact, while advocacy groups quietly began drafting joint letters of support. For Crockett, the hearing marked a shift in her political trajectory. Once seen primarily as a rising progressive voice, she was now being cast as something more, a legislator capable of building coalitions across divides. For Moran, the move carried political risk, but also reinforced his reputation as a pragmatic statesman, grounded in the needs of his constituents rather than the demands of his party. As the sun set on Capitol Hill that evening, one question lingered in the minds of those who had witnessed the hearing. Was this moment the exception that proved the rule of partisan dysfunction, or the spark of something larger? A reminder that even in the most divided times, common ground still exists if leaders are willing to look for it. There were no dramatic gestures, no rehearsed theatrics for the cameras, just two public servants standing shoulder to shoulder, acknowledging that shared purpose can exist even when political philosophies diverge. What no one inside that hearing room could have anticipated was just how far this rare moment of genuine cooperation would reach. By the time the gavel struck to close the session, the atmosphere had already shifted. Within hours, the footage of Senator Moran's endorsement of Congresswoman Crockett's rural health care bill was ricocheting across news outlets and social media feeds. For a nation long accustomed to gridlock and bitter divides, the scene felt almost cinematic. A conservative Republican senator and a progressive Democrat, not merely debating, but actually agreeing, and with conviction. As the two lawmakers exited the Capitol building that afternoon, the crowd awaiting them seemed larger than either expected. Reporters surged forward, microphones raised, their questions firing in rapid succession. The media rarely devoted this kind of attention to a subcommittee hearing, and it was clear they were struggling to reconcile what they had just witnessed with the well-worn scripts of partisanship. "Senator Moran," one journalist called out, "does your support for Representative Crockett's bill represent a shift in Republican healthcare policy?" Moran paused, his expression calm but deliberate. His words landed with quiet force. My support signals one thing: that I evaluate legislation by its merits, not by the party label of the person proposing it. This bill addresses real, urgent needs in rural Kansas and across America. Good policy deserves recognition, no matter who authors it. The answer rippled through the crowd, equal parts surprising and disarming. Then the questions turned toward Crockett. "Congresswoman, aren't you concerned about backlash from progressives for partnering with a conservative senator?" She did not flinch. Her reply carried the same steady conviction. "My duty is to the people I serve, the families struggling with healthcare access in Dallas, in Kansas, and in countless communities nationwide. If that means working with colleagues across the aisle, then that's what effective governance demands. The real question is, why should this kind of cooperation be the exception instead of the norm?" It was not politics as usual. There were no rehearsed slogans, no evasions. Instead, what unfolded before the cameras was something rare, a conversation grounded in substance, with both legislators outlining the specific provisions of the bill and the realities they were designed to address. Moran drew from his decades of experience. "In western Kansas, we've lost 7 rural hospitals in just 10 years. When a town loses its hospital, it begins to lose everything: jobs, families, even hope. This is not a Republican issue or a Democratic issue. It is a human issue, a survival issue." Crockett added her own stark examples. "In Dallas County, there are neighborhoods where the average life expectancy is 15 years lower than communities just a few miles away. That gap exists because of the same forces driving rural decline: lack of providers, barriers to transportation, and the absence of preventive care. These challenges cut across geography, race, and politics." The candor of their words struck reporters who were used to surface-level talking points. Questions grew more detailed, drilling into funding mechanisms, provider incentives, and telehealth expansion. For once, the spectacle of politics was overshadowed by the substance of policy. As the clips circulated online, the reaction revealed something profound. Americans across the political spectrum, long weary of endless conflict, were moved by this glimpse of cooperation. Conservative voices admitted that if Senator Moran, respected for decades of advocacy on rural issues, saw merit in the bill, then it deserved serious consideration. Progressive advocates, instead of chastising Crockett for bipartisanship, celebrated the breakthrough as a rare path toward enacting reforms they had championed for years. By evening, major networks had picked up the story. Analysts, often fluent in cynicism, struggled to fit the moment into familiar patterns of partisan rivalry. One veteran correspondent reflected, "What we've seen here is not just the rare crossing of party lines. It is a challenge to the assumption that gridlock is permanent. It suggests that when lawmakers focus on shared human problems rather than party narratives, governance still has the power to surprise us." The following morning, invitations poured in for joint interviews, Moran and Crockett appearing side by side on national programs. The framing was unusual, not confrontation, but collaboration. In one segment, a host tried to provoke division, asking Moran how he could possibly support a bill authored by one of the most progressive members of Congress. His response distilled the essence of the alliance. "I've spent my career fighting for rural communities. If someone proposes real solutions to the problems my constituents face, I don't check their political affiliation before I listen." Congresswoman Crockett did the hard work. She studied the realities of rural health care, and she brought forward answers that can make a difference. That deserves respect, not dismissal. Crockett, too, refused to indulge in partisanship. Instead, she echoed the same theme: responsibility to people over parties, solutions over slogans. In those exchanges, viewers across America saw something they had almost forgotten to expect: leaders acting like leaders. And in that unexpected unity, a fragile but powerful hope began to take shape. The following morning, the script of Washington politics began to shift in ways no strategist could have predicted. What started as a single exchange in a committee room had spiraled outward, drawing not only media fascination, but also a surge of curiosity within Congress itself. Other lawmakers, watching the public's unusually warm reaction, sensed opportunity. One by one, colleagues from both chambers approached Senator Moran and Congresswoman Crockett, not with rehearsed skepticism, but with genuine interest. A handful of House Republicans quietly requested technical briefings on the legislation, eager to understand its scope. Across the Capitol, several Senate Democrats reached out to Moran, asking when he planned to introduce his companion bill. By midday, congressional leadership was recalibrating. What had begun as a footnote in a subcommittee was now forcing leaders to respond on the record. The Senate Majority Leader, who just hours earlier dismissed the story as a blip, changed tone when pressed by reporters. His words were measured, but unmistakably different. "We'll review Senator Moran's proposal carefully. Rural health care access is a priority we all share." On the House side, the Speaker echoed the cautious shift. "The committee process is working as intended," she noted, signaling tacit acknowledgement of the bill's momentum. The careful language revealed something important. Party leaders were watching the same thing the public was, a rare moment of trust and cooperation that people actually wanted to believe in. To oppose it outright was to risk appearing tone-deaf to the electorate. Late that afternoon, the White House itself entered the conversation. During the daily press briefing, a reporter asked about the unexpected legislation. The press secretary, rarely one to wade into half-formed congressional efforts, chose her words with precision. "The president has consistently emphasized the importance of expanding healthcare access in underserved communities. We're encouraged to see bipartisan energy behind these challenges and look forward to reviewing the specific provisions of the bill." Though non-committal, the statement was significant. It signaled that the executive branch was open, perhaps even eager, to claim part of this unlikely breakthrough. That evening, away from the cameras and microphones, Moran requested a private meeting with Crockett. No aides, no staff, just two legislators, stripped of party armor, seated across a table with nothing but legal pads and coffee between them. For over an hour, they spoke not of strategy, but of substance, refinements to the bill, the architecture of implementation, the delicate balance between national standards and local flexibility. When they finally emerged, reporters noticed something unusual. Both looked energized, almost defiant, as though they had tapped into a current Washington had long forgotten. "We've identified several refinements that will strengthen the legislation," Moran announced calmly. Crockett added, "Our teams will coordinate on adjustments before the Senate companion bill is formally introduced. We're also tailoring guidelines to recognize the unique needs of different regions. Kansas isn't Appalachia, and Appalachia isn't the Mississippi Delta. This bill must serve them all." It was not the language of partisan maneuvering. It was the language of governance. By nightfall, political analysts were struggling to catch up with the story's implications. One seasoned scholar offered a striking observation on national television. "This may be more than a momentary anomaly. It suggests that beneath Washington's endless theater of conflict, there is still a latent capacity for problem solving. When politicians stop performing division and start addressing shared pain points, the public responds." And respond they did. Social media metrics told the story bluntly. Clips of Moran and Crockett discussing rural hospitals, transportation deserts, and health inequities drew more engagement than the partisan squabbles that usually dominate coverage. The contrast was stark. Americans weren't just entertained, they were hungry for it. In Kansas, local news stations interviewed voters who seemed almost startled by what they were witnessing. "I don't agree with Moran on a lot," admitted one lifelong Democrat. "But he's always been serious about rural health. If he sees value in this bill, that matters more than party labels." In Texas, the reaction was mirrored from the other side of the spectrum. "Crockett's not my representative of choice," said a Republican rancher. "But if she's working to keep rural hospitals open, that's something we can't afford to lose, red state or blue." What these voices revealed was something Washington often forgot. Most Americans were less obsessed with ideological purity than with the simple question of whether government could still function. But beneath the optimism lurked tension. That night, both Moran and Crockett received calls from their party leaders, conversations not disclosed to the public, but whispered about in Washington's corridors. Some pressure, some caution, some hints of quiet approval. Each legislator now faced a choice: bend back toward the partisan gravity that defined modern politics, or lean into the dangerous but hopeful path they had begun to chart together. The days ahead would reveal whether this alliance marked a fleeting anomaly or the fragile birth of something new. Local newspapers, often aligned with their traditional partisan leanings, surprised readers by breaking with expectation. In Kansas, conservative editorial boards set aside loyalty to party lines, choosing instead to highlight the substance of Senator Moran's decision. Senator Moran's endorsement of bipartisan healthcare solutions reflects the independent judgment Kansans have long demanded from their representatives, wrote the Wichita Eagle. By evaluating legislation based on merit rather than source, he has signaled a return to substantive governance over political theater. In Dallas, the response was strikingly similar. Community leaders from across the ideological spectrum recognized the significance of Crockett's approach. "Congresswoman Crockett promised results over rhetoric," said one respected pastor. "Her willingness to collaborate with Republican colleagues on healthcare solutions proves that promise is more than just words." What happened next was more than a single ripple. It became a wave. Other lawmakers, closely watching public reaction, began to reassess their own stalled initiatives. Long-dormant bills on infrastructure, prescription drug reform, and veteran services were suddenly being dusted off as members from both parties sought opportunities to demonstrate the same kind of practical cooperation that had elevated Moran and Crockett. 3 days after the hearing, Moran formally introduced the Senate companion to Crockett's bill. What stunned Washington insiders was not just the bill itself, but the coalition behind it. 7 co-sponsors spanning the aisle, 4 Republicans and 3 Democrats. In an era when bipartisan support for major legislation had become almost unthinkable, this coalition signaled something different. "This legislation addresses urgent health care challenges facing communities across America," Moran declared. "I'm proud to join colleagues from both parties in ensuring that Americans, no matter where they live, have access to essential medical services." Crockett's version in the House quickly gained momentum as well. A handful of moderate Republicans, previously reluctant to align with any bill branded as progressive, signed on as co-sponsors. The healthcare subcommittee scheduled a markup session at unusual speed, a procedural move that underscored how momentum had shifted. Policy experts, advocacy groups, and provider organizations now engaged with the bill on its substance rather than its politics. Medical associations praised reimbursement reforms, while rural health advocates highlighted telehealth provisions. For once, debates centered on improving care rather than scoring partisan points. Perhaps the most powerful testimony came not from experts, but from ordinary citizens. Rural hospital administrators in Kansas submitted sobering data showing how the proposed changes could prevent closures threatening their communities. In Dallas, health advocates spoke about patients forced to travel hours for treatment and how telehealth expansion could change lives. These stories, personal, concrete, undeniable, gave the legislation weight beyond Washington's usual posturing. 2 weeks later, the full House Healthcare Committee advanced the bill with only minor amendments. The vote wasn't unanimous. There were holdouts from both sides, but the bipartisan support was undeniable. Media coverage shifted accordingly. Instead of sensationalizing partisan conflict, headlines focused on substance, how reimbursement changes would affect providers, how telehealth would integrate with existing systems, and how workforce programs could help rural and urban underserved areas alike. This substantive reporting had an amplifying effect. Constituents weren't just watching, they were engaging. Congressional offices received calls not only of support, but with detailed feedback from people eager to shape provisions that directly touched their lives. It was the kind of civic participation rarely seen in an era dominated by partisan outrage. 6 weeks after the initial hearing, the improbable became reality. The House passed the Rural Health Care Access and Improvement Act with broad bipartisan support. 2 weeks later, the Senate followed. When the president signed the bill into law, surrounded not by politicians, but by rural doctors, nurses, and community advocates, it felt less like a political victory and more like a reminder of what governance could be. At the signing, both Moran and Crockett stood shoulder to shoulder. Moran told the crowd, "This legislation proves that when we judge ideas on merit rather than party, we can build solutions that serve millions of Americans." Crockett added, "These aren't Democratic provisions or Republican provisions. They are evidence-based responses to urgent needs. This is what governance should look like: problems identified, solutions developed, and implementation achieved through collaboration." The president himself acknowledged their role. Senator Moran and Congresswoman Crockett have shown that even in divided times, cooperation is possible when leaders place people above politics. This law will change lives in communities long left behind. Beyond policy, the alliance between Moran and Crockett forced a broader reckoning. Editorial boards, civic leaders, and political analysts began questioning the long-assumed inevitability of partisan warfare. For perhaps the first time in years, Washington had shown that division was not destiny, that there was still room for courage, compromise, and genuine progress. Americans watching this legislative journey saw something rare: governance as it was always meant to function. It wasn't the disappearance of disagreement. Senator Moran and Congresswoman Crockett still held sharply different political philosophies. But what captivated the public was their ability to locate shared concerns in the middle of that divide, and then craft practical, meaningful responses. In the months following the bill's passage, opinion researchers uncovered a truth many in Washington had long ignored. Ordinary Americans valued problem-solving far more than partisan purity. Voters across the spectrum, from conservative farmers in Kansas to working-class families in Dallas, spoke with surprising unity. They approved of leaders willing to cross party lines to deliver real solutions to real problems. And perhaps most strikingly, this success provided a template for tackling other long-paralyzed issues: infrastructure development, immigration reform, prescription drug pricing, all topics gridlocked by years of political theater, suddenly carried the glimmer of possibility. Moran and Crockett's collaboration had cracked open the idea that partisanship didn't have to be the final word. For the two lawmakers themselves, the experience was transformative. They didn't shed their political identities, nor did they pretend to agree on everything. But they discovered that their differences could actually strengthen the outcomes when harnessed constructively. "Senator Moran and I don't see the world the same way," Crockett admitted in an interview 6 months later. "But we've shown that disagreement doesn't block progress when there's genuine overlap in our concerns. That's how a diverse democracy should work, not by erasing differences, but by building bridges despite them." Moran echoed the sentiment. Congresswoman Crockett brings experiences and perspectives I don't share, and that's precisely why our collaboration has been so effective. Engaging with diverse viewpoints makes legislation stronger. Ignoring them makes it weaker. Their ongoing partnership, rooted in substance rather than political calculation, stood as a powerful rebuke to the performance politics dominating Washington. And slowly, other lawmakers took notice. Legislators weary of endless stalemate began reaching across the aisle in search of productive engagement instead of public spectacle. The enduring legacy of this unexpected alliance wasn't confined to healthcare access, though the law itself improved the lives of millions in underserved communities. Its deeper impact lay in something more profound. It proved that an alternative existed. In a climate where performative conflict so often overshadowed solutions, Moran and Crockett modeled a different path, one where proposals were judged on merit, not on origin, one where clashing perspectives, when combined, produced more complete solutions, one where serving communities came before scoring partisan victories. This didn't erase the philosophical differences or even the fierce electoral competition that defines American democracy, but it demonstrated something vital, that beneath the daily noise and gridlock, there remains capacity for the substantive cooperation democracy demands. For many citizens, watching a Republican from Kansas and a Democrat from Texas join forces was almost shocking in its simplicity. The message it carried was clear and deeply resonant. Governance can still work when leaders remember who they serve. And so the story leaves us with a challenge. If this kind of cooperation is possible, even in today's climate, how can we encourage more of it? How can we demand that our elected officials evaluate ideas on their substance, seek common ground despite differences, and place the needs of their communities above partisan theater? If this story sparked hope, share it. Talk about it. Because the path forward for democracy requires citizens who actively support problem-solving over performance, substance over spectacle. What part of this story resonated most with you? Let us know in the comments, and join the conversation about how we, together, can inspire our leaders to focus